Nā mai haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa, and warm Pacific greetings, ko Sara Tako Ingoa. So welcome to my presentation, which is across today management and He Kaupapa Hononga. So I've got people in here that's really echoey, who will know a lot of what I'm talking about already, and I'm sorry. And then there's people who might provide in the context for who it might be new, and I might race through it, but hopefully throughout the presentation we'll get it to work. So today is going to be actually more industry engagement focused than theory. So I'm not really going to be giving a normal research seminar as such, but just talking a little bit about the work that I've been doing with staff and now the lever room, and talking a little bit about emission reporting and how that works, and then the next steps of the project as well. Can't see the slides. Okay, cool, radio, that's all right. All right, so I'm just going to start with context to begin with. And this is from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And there's a lot of data in some of these tables, but I just want to pull out a few key things. So this is trying to look at some of the scenarios. So a lot of what the IPC does is have some scenarios that look out as to what happens with certain levels of warming. And this one here is trying to do that as well. So it's trying to predict out, if you were born in 2020, what sort of experiences you're going to have around extreme warming. Born in 1980, there at 70 years old, you'll start to have sort of intermediate levels of warming. And if you're born in the 1950s, from when we always equate the year 1950 to the year of mass consumption, or beginning of mass consumption, you will you'll have sort of moderate levels of warming. So trying to look out in terms of what. So those people born in the from 2020 onwards, and perhaps even before in many ways, are going to experience quite high levels of warming. Whoops. Brought the wee clicker with me. And those risks, this one here is just to show that the risks of warming mean that we are strongly being increased. With every sort of increment of warming, we've got more risks that we're going to see. So more sort of physical risks and social risks to the way in which we operate on this planet. I'm whipping through these ones here. This is what I wanted to just show you, this one in particular, because we think that we've got many plans that are actually going to get us towards a reduction of climate. But actually, when we start to look at these kind of graphs like this here, we see that actually the policies that are currently in place and those that are being sort of, organised at the moment actually get us into this range here, which is not really going to limit our warming to 2 degrees or 1.5. So 1.5 degrees is what we hear a lot about in terms of the Paris Agreement. And obviously we'd want to try and keep our warming to under 2 or 3 degrees, because the bifurcation, the changes that we get once we go beyond that, are quite significant to how we operate on the planet. So just a couple of things as well in terms of the background, because I don't know how much people in my department know about the Paris Agreement and those kind of things. So just a little bit of background around that. So this slide here is around the Paris Agreement, which is trying to keep a global agreement, trying to keep our warming levels at 1.5 degrees. So it came into force in November 2016 and came out of one of the conferences of the parties that are held all the time. And you know that climate people get quite excited about them because we keep thinking that something might actually come out of them. And then every time they have a COP meeting, we always get kind of quite disappointed. And this one here, and back in 2015 came the Paris, what's known as the Paris Agreement. So out of that, countries have to submit nationally determined contributions. And that is what we're going to do as a country in order to reduce and try and get to that 1.5 or keep at that ceiling of that 1.5 degree warming. And then we have to have plans of action to reduce those emissions. and lots of adaptation actions as well. So we have to look at mitigation and adaptation. So in climate change, we always talk about those two things. What do we do to mitigate, to reduce our emissions, and what do we do to adapt and get ready for climate change? And so we have to also submit long-term strategies. And the EU were the first to do this, and they actually way ahead of most countries. They developed what's called the Green Deal at that point and submitted their long-term plan. So in New Zealand, we have been developing plans at a national level, and we're starting to see some plans being developed at council levels as well, although currently our council seems to be stalling on our one, setting targets but not actually doing the plans. So nationally we have these, and particularly last year we saw two major ones come out with the Emissions Reduction Plan 2022 and the National Adaptation Plan. These tend to still be quite, I guess, vague in a way, in many ways. They're still kind of quite high level in terms of what they actually have in them. And then I've got this big diagram here, and this is just to show you the overall arching, I guess, policies and changes that we're going to see at a national level around climate change. And so when the Climate Change Commission starts releasing its advice and the government picks up on that and starts developing plans, we start to see the policy shifts happening. Of course, we're going into an election, which could change a number of these different things, which is kind of a little scary because at least we've got some sort of plan at the moment. So in here, there's different reduction plans that keep having to be updated all the time. And you can see those are updated every few years. Then they've got a long-term emission strategy here. And that really is around creating a low carbon or low emissions economy. And so you can see the vision up there is a productive, sustainable and inclusive economy. And so that's the kind of wider picture of the government. And then looking down here into these sector plans and system settings, to different levels here, Māori central government, and then down to that's just got our current sort of level of emissions. So it is sort of got some bigger plan, but remember that when we were on that slide there, these plans are sitting in the pink area. They're not down and actually helping us. So we've still got a few issues with the plans that are being developed, and New Zealand sits very much in there. But I like to keep things really simple when we've got all of this and think about a carbon budget, and that we can actually only afford to emit so much more carbon in order to keep temperatures under certain levels. And so this, I think this is a nice diagram here because you can see if we want to stay at 1.5 degrees, we can only emit that amount of carbon. That's all we've got left in order to stay below 1.5 degrees. When we get to 2 degrees, we've got a bit more, and 3 degrees, and the latest report, which I took those initial diagrams from, was saying we're actually on track for 3 to 4 degrees. So we're carrying on like we've got all this to emit, pretty much at the moment. So yeah, but if we want to actually have some sort of system on this planet that sits in line with something like we've got now, we probably need to start reducing quite considerably. So from all that then, we've got quite a bit of work to do. And as I with those different aspects there, I'm moving to the point that business actually has quite a significant role to play in reducing these emissions. So they're quite a significant part of our emissions profile, that energy, agriculture, industry, a lot of that is related to business in New Zealand. And it also got to be a significant part of shifting towards actually getting that graph down. So out of the Paris Agreement, in terms of setting reductions, there came what's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And that helps at different levels, so across countries, councils and organisations, to actually create some targets that are science-based, that sit in line with what's called the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degrees. So, and I'll talk about these throughout as well. So I'll talk about organisations having science-based targets in terms of what they need to mitigate by. Okay, so now I'm going to get down into looking at the companies and what they're actually doing in terms of responding to some of these significant global challenges and also local pushes around mitigating carbon. So I'm going to focus today on the inventory reports because that's the key area that I've been looking at and evaluating as part of the STUFF project. So this is a nice glossy front page of the Air New Zealand report here. But what does a report actually have in it? And the reports have come a long way from when I first started teaching. So many of you will know in organisations and sustainability, everyone does a carbon footprint. And I've had that in for years because I think it's basic sort of knowledge of how to be able to compile a carbon footprint. But it's actually, as I said, shifting quite a bit at the moment, which is quite exciting. So just a bit of lingo for you. There's 3 scopes in a carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is those sources that are directly owned by the organisation, that the organisation has a lot of control over. And these are things like travel in company-owned vehicles and the stationary combustion of fuels. So if an organisation has a boiler, for example, like Fonterra, puts their coal boilers in the scope 1 and any travel owned by the vehicle. Scope 2 is getting further away from the organisation's locus of control and is any electricity, and that's usually grid electricity, grid energy that's used, and that's it, so the kilowatt hours in there. And then scope 3 is where all the action is at the moment. So this used to be a few different things that were getting further away from the organisational control and used to have things like any travel in non-owned company vehicles like taxis and planes and all rental cars and all that kind of stuff. And then you would have waste to landfill, and then you might have employee travel, employee commuting in there. Scope 3 at the moment is actually being completely opened up, and is it used to be where you would think about opening it up to supply chains and value chains and think, oh no, we're double counting because that would be part of another company's supply chain. Now it's not. Now the idea of double counting is no longer an argument, and organisations are having to start to think about all the emissions that their activities might be responsible for across all of its supply chain. So you can imagine this has sent companies into quite a spin in the past few years and still is. So most companies that will be starting to measure their emissions profile would really start with a scope 1 and a scope 2. But you can't now ignore the scope 3, and they're all having to work towards doing this. And this one, this diagram here, I've taken from the WRI, and it's used pretty globally, really, to start to talk about those upstream and downstream emissions that go into the scope 3. So you can imagine here now the organisation has actually been forced to be more responsible across its supply chain than would normally be considered. So sort of opening up those boundaries of what we consider to be an organisation and what they might want to be responsible for, which from a climate change and sustainability perspective is quite exciting because for a long time these were very boring. They were sort of like very contained documents that, you know, and the companies would tightly bound them, had very tight boundaries around them. So got a bit more interesting. Secondly, the other thing that's happening is around climate risk disclosures. So the Task Force on Climate Risk Financial Disclosures globally started a number of years ago and started looking at what would be the key things that we'd want to see companies disclose on. So largely this is around investing in the financial sector. So it's kind of going, well, okay, if people are going to be investing in companies, they need to actually be able to understand what their climate risks are in order to be able to invest in them. So we need companies to start disclosing on these. And so in New Zealand, we're the first country in the world to make it mandatory, and so mandatory this year to disclose key risks around climate change, and they are in terms of set up into 4 main areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So there's a number of different things that companies are expected to disclose on, and there's a whole lot of writing there, but essentially they've really got to outline their key physical risks from climate change, their transition risks, which means that if a company's not transitioning, then that's a risk to the organisation. And they've got to do scenarios, so they've got to look out to 2030, 2040 And they've got to also disclose their their emissions profile as well. So that's quite a significant shift as well, putting a lot more data out. So that's supposed to be, providing that data for investors, so investors are making an informed decision on what they'll actually, what they're actually investing in. Because let's face it, we've got a real issue with stranded assets. So that, is bringing about in order to kind of alleviate some of those concerns. This has been an interesting process, I guess, with organisations. Some have started practicing early, and so we see some early disclosures coming through. Some are clearly leaving it to the last minute, and one wonders what they will look like. We're seeing industry associations sort of join together to produce scenarios for companies to then sort of use at that industry level. So yeah, interesting things happening in that space. But it's definitely meaning that companies are having to talk about climate. Big push at the moment, not all companies have to do it. There's a certain standard that have to do it, but big push around insurance and banks, because banks are considered, I guess, key players in this industry because they're loaning money to things that are actually a major climate risk. So that's why they're having to open up those conversations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what we did. So that's all the sort of context to get us to where we were. So last year, I don't know when it was early last year, maybe April or May, I got an email from the climate change editor at Stuff, and she said, we're doing this project and we want to evaluate the emission reporting of our key emitters in Aotearoa New Zealand. Would you be on the panel? And I thought, oh, yeah, all right. I guess I could do that. And thinking that it would be a bit of an evaluation and then a meeting, and then that would be it over and done with. And that was really not the case. And that's why this title here is, we assess companies on their climate actions, and it almost broke us because it took a really long time to do this project. So what we're trying to produce was this report card. So we had a meeting, and we'd all gone and done our evaluations, and Eloise from Stuff had written to all the companies, and so we had data from them. We had and data that we'd also generated from their websites, and we went through and we evaluated. And I think on the next slide, we've got the team here. There was Barry Coates, who started Mindful Money, Paul Brownsy, who started Pathfinder, which are sort of sustainable investing areas, Rebecca Mills from the Lever Room, and Eloise and myself. And most of the time we were fairly consistent on many of our evaluations. But what Stuff were doing also was doing some sort of automated evaluation in the background. And so when we'd done our bit and they did their bit and we put the results together, they made no sense whatsoever. And so we kind of got the results of that and went, that doesn't really look like our conversation, and it doesn't really look like anything I'd be hand on heart happy to put out there. Because one thing that was also in the back of my mind was that we could actually cop a lot of flack from this, right? Because we're evaluating companies and they're spending a lot of time on these lovely reports, and then we're saying, oh, this isn't very good. So we had to make sure that whatever was going to go out was going to actually be something that was defendable. So when it came back, it was like, we can't do this. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and figure out what we were going to do in order to be able to put something out that made sense. So being a researcher, I used a classic research tool called Google and spent a bit of time doing an environmental scan, I'll call it, of what was going on in terms of evaluating reporting. So yeah, just looking at what was going on globally. Clearly, the hotspot is in Europe. There's a lot of stuff happening there, and on the continent there, a lot of stuff around reporting, anything to do with net zero and looking at targets and metrics and things like that. And I came across the New Climate Institute that operates out of Berlin, and they had already done something quite similar. So what I did was, and this is what they, and so I did. And also what they've done is they provided a methodology. So they had their report of, and they'd gone to, and they'd done it in the Netherlands, and they'd looked at and a number of companies in the Netherlands. They'd done about 100 or so, and they've gone through all of their reports and analysed them using this particular framework, which looks kind of similar to what we ended up doing, but we ended up sort of adapting it. And then every different company they had, they'd gone and produced a report, a couple of pages on. So what I did then was take what they'd done, take what we had in front of us, and produce an evaluation scheme for looking through the reports. So the key things that we wanted to look at was firstly was transparency. So really, how transparent were these organisations and what they were doing, and could we actually follow the reports? And you think it's going to be really easy, but as Joe knows, I've spent 4 hours with the 447 students in the last few classes. It's actually really quite difficult to figure them out. They use percentages here, they use real numbers here, they use this over there, and there's that report, and then there's another report over there that they've got some more information on. So I won't comment on that, but it does seem quite opaque in many ways of trying to actually get the information together. Some are really good, so it's not all. So that was the first thing I did was actually go through the transparency, and then I went through the integrity. So what do these results actually say? And are they actually saying anything that's meaningful here? So what's the integrity of what the organisations are saying? And rank them from 0 to 5, and went through and did that every company that we had. And we only had, I think, 13 altogether. So it wasn't much. And I had to look after teenage boys at a tennis tournament over Labour weekend. So doing this was kind of a bit of relief, to be honest, from watching too much tennis. So that was what I took it upon, we talked about it. It's mainly Rebecca, Eloise and I kind of carried on with this here. So, but what we ended up doing was taking some of those aspects and talking about transparency and alignment and impact. So sort of taking some of those aspects and slightly translating them. So we, and I've taken that from the staff article, that was how we defined transparency. And you can see I've just taken this one here, and I know it's small writing, sorry, but that's from Frontiera's report. So you can see even there that it's quite difficult to actually, you've got a reduction in absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's the target of a 30% reduction by 2030 from a year 9 to a 2018 baseline, and you've got 1.8 reduction and then 3.5. And so you're kind of looking at it going, well, what does that actually mean? And here you've got your net change, which does have your sort of things, but that doesn't necessarily add up to the ones above it. So you're sort of going, what did you actually reduce by, and how did you actually reduce? So that's just one sort of example there of Fonterra, who have given themselves a green light that they're on target, by the way, as well. So you're going to go and spend quite a bit of time figuring those kind of aspects out. Impact is how well the organisations were going at cutting emissions, which was including their supply chain, and also how well they were to cut those emissions deeply into the future. And this one here I've taken from Meridian, and this is quite a good example. And again, they had a number of different reports, so we had to go across reports to find their information. But they're going half by 30, so they want to halve their emissions by 2030. They've got horizons 1, 2, and 3, so they're using that horizons model that they're on a trajectory now. There'll be another trajectory that'll go up and down, and their third one will come up, and that will be the one that will take them to half. So they're kind of breaking that down out to 2030 with different levels of what they're doing across land, farms, fugitive emissions, air travel, ferry and barge, and waste. So they're breaking that all down. So that was kind of relatively transparent, and you could start to see at exactly what sort of things they were doing around impact. And then we did alignment, which is slightly different to integrity, but a lot of it was focused around integrity. But we wanted to bring in the greenwashing, because last year there was quite a lot of stuff coming through around greenwashing. So as part of the EU's Green Deal that I mentioned before, they are also starting to fine for organisations that are greenwashing. So we wanted to have an element of greenwashing coming into this year. And so we were looking at where they were lobbying as well. So we spent a bit of time doing, again, the Google searches and various different things around trying to find out what the organisation was doing. using offsets that didn't have integrity. So where they were using offsets, we looked them up to see whether they were just planting pine trees or whether that was natives or what they were doing in that, or whether they were making business decisions that were hurting or helping the climate impact in the end. So this was a harder, more subjective set around this. And so in order to make it less subjective, luckily at the same time, because greenwashing was huge last year, there was a UN high-level expert group that produced a report, including our Climate Change Commissioner, Rod Carr, was on it. And so they gave us some sort of principles here that we could use around sort of the greenwashing and alignment. They had alignment and transparency things there. And then they had a number of different recommendations for organisations in order to avoid greenwashing. So we kind of came up with these things here that we were kind of looking for there. And you can see there, you can't get to net zero emissions by buying carbon offsets instead of cutting your own emissions. So we had a number of criteria that we went and looked for in order to rank them in that way. So that report was, sometimes you have those serendipitous moments where you're like, perfect timing, that report coming out. So that meant that we could be relatively rigorous about that as well. So then we ended up we decided, we ummed and ahed about how to do them, whether to do A, B or C, or how to actually present this data back, using sort of infographics. And in the end, we decided to go with the sort of traffic lightish approach. So it's really easy to see there. And you can see there's a few greens, so we weren't totally mean with every company, but there's quite a few reds and oranges in there, as well as some yellows, which are working towards. So, we tried to have our objectivity in there. So then in each different company, we provided their scope emissions breakdown. We made a quick comment from the judges, and this one here, Z Energy, and we said, well, decent at counting and revealing emissions. Z lacks a strong plan for the crucial bit, shifting out of fossil fuels. So Z did this really good report, but they sell petrol, and that was sort of like ignored, and the whole sort of transition plan moving away from that. You could be slightly cynical and think, well, they're sitting and obviously exploiting that for as long as possible before actually having to really shift. So you can see some electric, stations coming in, but yeah, so we just found that wasn't the alignment there. They didn't yet do very well in the reporting. And then we just had a little bit about Z, and then all of these went back to the organisations before they were printed, and every organisation had the opportunity to respond. And that was Z's response there, which just adds a little bit extra information. One of the key issues we had was that because it took us so long to come up with this, we'd asked them quite early on in the year, and then this wasn't released until March 2023, and that's where we copped a bit of flack back from the companies, because they're like, well, we've actually produced this, and this since then, why can't you use that? And we decided to put a cut-off of that Labour weekend when I did that analysis, because I spent, and actually Andrea helped as well, as a research fellow there, we spent a bit of time sort of online getting that information, and we had to put a cut-off because otherwise we'd be keeping using information. So Silver Fern Farms, for example, produced their first climate risk disclosures in December, but we couldn't have that included, which didn't go down very well with Silver Fern Farms. It told me off. But we worked through that one. So there was that level, and I talked about at the start of that industry engagement. So we were really trying hard. And one of the things that we did set about with it was it wasn't just to tell them off and say you're not doing this very well, but it was actually to try and do a learning thing. So that's why we had all these kind of bits and pieces in there, so that actually organisations can learn from this whole process. Okay, so what needs to be done better is, I guess, a key thing about this. So for most of the reporters, it's actually just the basics of those transparency, integrity, and alignment, and actually working hard, obviously, on the mitigation and reducing carbon. I found the target setting was one of the key things that I had a real issue with a number of the reporters. So and that's why I talked about the science-based targets. That was used by some, but not by all. And we found that a lot of organisations were using the Climate Leaders Coalition as a sort of proxy for that. And that sort of really started to annoy me when I was reading it. And it's like, well, we're a member of the science, you know, the Climate Leaders Coalition. And the Climate Leaders Coalition have some guidelines of what you have to do to be a member of that, which one is reporting and one is reducing, but it's not actually setting those reduction targets in a science-based way. So for me, that didn't make, that wasn't a proxy for having a science-based target and actually having something. Otherwise, you're just plucking a figure out of the air. So I think it was really important to get the message across around the target setting needs to be done in that alignment. It would be good to get verified reports in there as well. So we've got a number, you know, all our 4 big accounting firms all verify, and Toitu as well. And some organisations again use Toitu as a way to say, yes, we're reducing, but again, without the science-based target, that target's not clear and it's not transparent, and then we don't know around the integrity on it. We looked quite a bit into the offsetting as well, and we followed the science-based target initiative here that offsetting should only be for hard to abate emissions. The offsetting is not the first choice of what these organisations should be doing. It should be the last choice of those emissions that you really can't shift and that are going to be really hard to mitigate. So, and that offsetting still needs to be done without greenwashing. So once you started looking at what organisations were doing and who they were working with, you started to see some sort of interesting activity. And so while it might claim to be this, there's still a lot of pine tree and exotic planting happening. And so it was kind of looking at those different aspects as well. So just to go back to a diagram again from the IPCC report here, just to remind us that there are a lot of things. So this is kind of a really simplistic way of just looking at those reporting of emissions by organisations, but it's actually a whole lot sort of more than that that's actually going to drive the change. This is just one, you know, little part of it. And so still, if we still keep going down here, if we're not getting our science-based targets, if we're not, you know, actually really seriously creating some impact and alignment with what organisations are doing, then where we're heading is not the place that we really want to be heading. So we do really want our organisations to be, part of it I think is to be held accountable. If you say that's what you're doing, then you should be doing it, and you should be able to clearly show that that's what you're doing. And people should be able to understand that relatively easily, because at the moment it's not that easy to understand, to go through all of that kind of information to figure out whether they're actually doing anything that's any good for the planet. And so we should really be able to get that information. So that's part of what's leading us, I guess, into the next steps is to continue on with these. I mean, I'd love to be able to do them every 6 months, but that's incredibly ambitious. But just to sort of be saying, look, this is where we are now. And then, you know, keeping going with it and sort of, in a way, holding organisations to account to say what they're going to be doing, because that's often what we don't do. I mean, still that Richard Branson annoys me when he pledged, you know, $300 million towards climate change, and then he spent about $3 million. And, you know, no one takes any notice of that, but they take a whole lot of notice of that pledge. So how do we manage to try and keep these organisations to account? And so I'm going to continue, Rebecca and I are going to continue working. Eloise has since shifted because staff has actually disbanded their climate change team, which is kind of really weird, but they're retrenching sort of big time. So Eloise has shifted to Radio New Zealand, and so we'll probably hopefully end up with a partnership with them around this. And it's figuring out, yeah, I mean, I would love to sort of have an institute that really got into some really cool infographics that we can release around this as well, and again have really good ways to sort of be able to update the data really quickly so we can actually see, because it's happening all sort of over Europe and New Zealand. We've got these XRB, you know, we've got the mandatory reporting coming through, so we should be starting to get better data. So we want to be able to do something with that to say actually what's kind of happening. So that's the other project that I have going on with Seb, who's teaching at the moment, and we're doing an effectiveness evaluation of the mandatory disclosures and looking at, I guess, whether or not the policy is actually working and what organisations are disclosing on and how they're going about disclosing. So that's I think it's a 3-year project. I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but So that's kind of an ongoing one. And we've got 20 interviews so far with organisations that have reported. So there's a bit of analysis to be done around that at the minute. And then I've got to, which of course gets put on the back burner all the time. And I thought, I'll do this presentation today, and then that'll force me to start writing the academic paper. And have I? Of course not. So maybe this will motivate me to do it because I've put it in writing now, but I really need to get an academic paper out based upon the method and these kind of findings from this. So that's why this presentation today has been far less about theory and results as opposed to sort of engagement, industry engagement and working with businesses. So that's me done, and I've raced through that because those of you know I am lecturing at 1, so I thought there might be some questions. Yeah.
I kind of get why they do it, but the double counting, how does that work? Like whenever you look at those scope 3s, so I appreciate that you need to count your downstream, absolutely. Yeah. But does it get double counted? Like are the suppliers also offsetting or whatever they're doing as well as the companies in practice?
Yeah. But that's what I've never had an issue with double counting because I'm like, well, if everyone actually mitigates, then that works really well.
It's double mitigation.
Yeah.
So is double counting double mitigation, or is there something else I'm missing? I think that's what I'm trying to work out.
Yeah, it could be double mitigation, would hopefully be double mitigation. So when we initially saw reporting done, organisations put really tight boundaries around what they were doing. And often it was even just head offices, we're only doing this, and all of that stuff out there we're not going to do. Meridian, we're classic. We know we've got coal-fired power station in Australia, but we're going to ignore Australia and we're only going to do New Zealand here. And so we saw that for a lot. But what's happening now is you can't do that any longer. So you cannot keep ignoring all of those other bits and pieces that you've got. And then you can't ignore the fact that what you do enables all of that downstream and all of that upstream. So yeah, it does get, and so if you've got an organisation here that does its carbon footprint and it's also having to mitigate and look upstream and downstream, then you do have these big convoluted things going on, which is initially what organisations were saying no. And now it's like, yes. So it's kind of opening up that stewardship angle for organisations and ways that they can't sort of say, that's not us any longer. Yeah. And if everyone mitigates, then it should actually all cancel it all out. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. That was really interesting. One question about the reporting that the companies do. Do you think it would be helpful to come up with seems like they're all doing their own thing, and you explained how difficult it was to go through the numbers. Would it be helpful to have some kind of framework? Do you think they would be open if someone like your group would develop a framework for them to make the reporting more easy to, or is that not what they want because they want to hide and polish their numbers?
There is a framework, and I mean there are ISO standards, so they're International Standards Authority, and so there's those, and there's the GHG protocol, which is what they're all following. So the reports all look the same, very institutionalized as well, but it's how they present the data and amongst that.
Couldn't there be rules about how you present it, if it's percentages or actual numbers?
There could be. It would be nice to see. So it would be clear recommendations to have raw data. Some are, like Air New Zealand, surprisingly, show a lot of their raw data. So some do and some don't. And it is, I guess, part of this is to push them to say, be more transparent, show us your data. Because then you're not going to rate very highly in transparency, and then we can't tell the integrity of your data as well. So this is part of what we're doing as well. Yeah, one day hopefully.
Hi. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing this. I just actually have 3 questions. So the first one is, so I probably have missed that, but why you started with 17 corporations? Like, is it emissions? The biggest emitters?
Yep, they were the biggest emitters and the biggest place where New Zealanders spend their money.
Right. Oh, okay, so
And next I'd like to go to banks, if you, I missed that bit at the end as well, yeah.
you know the percentage, like in terms of emissions, in percentage against the gross emissions of New Zealand?
No, because they didn't all reply either, but that's a good question. It would be good to do that in infographics too. There were some cool infographics actually, and it would be easy to get that were in the spin-off, I think, that actually put them into a square and had them all in there. And so we used that, but I don't know that. Good question. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Another thing is, do you, I guess, okay, so for the offset, I'm quite interested in the offsetting. So because, okay, so in each corporation's report, do they actually mention explicitly when are they going to use offsetting so that you know, at least you know, right? Because you don't want them to use that the first solution. Do they actually mention that in the report?
No, not necessarily. Some of them do in relation to their strategy, about when they offset them and how they'll do that. Some are just offsetting straight away. So they're already offsetting without, and you can see what they're doing to abate. And then you see what they're doing to offsetting and you say, well, they're not actually doing much over there, but they're just offsetting. So it was that kind of stuff that we sort of looked for in relation to that.
Oh, okay.
So when you read it, you can see, but they don't really talk. And again, it's getting that language of the science-based targets initiative through, so they start using that as a base as opposed to whatever they think is important at the moment.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. And my last question is, because I feel the scorecard kind of thing is going to be very useful for this corporation to keep track of their performance. So do you see that, I don't know, if you have enough, I mean, human power, would you do an annual update? Like say, I think it would be nice to, you know, to monitor.
Yeah, so we really want to. And interestingly enough, we've had companies come to us to ask to be part of it. So, and they've been like, we'll give you the data. It's all right. And big companies. So that was really useful. And we'll include them next time as well. And then the ones that have done it, like I know, like I've had engagement with, for example, Silverfern Farms, who are like, oh, sweet, you know, and want to have a bit more engagement around it. So that's been quite good. And I think a number of them want to be done again. So yeah, they want to see that, and they're keen to show us what they've done. Like, you know, this is what we've done since, and can you do this and that kind of thing. So generally, when you just having done those interviews with 20 sustainability people, there's this whole area. People are so much, you know, the expertise has kind of grown exponentially. So they're really into it, really interested in it, and trying to figure out how to do better. So there's a genuineness in there as well. Yeah. I know. Yeah. No. Well, I've gone with a partnership, and we've gone with that model at the moment. But yeah, when I get some headspace over summer, I can figure it out. But yeah. Thanks.
I was just wondering, and it relates to Paul's question about the double mitigation. Was there evidence of those firms collaborating with other companies in their supply chain to reduce their? Is that something that can be highlighted? I mean, I ask because industry policy is starting to push more between public, private, the types of collaborations that can occur. And I just thought that must pop up in there if they're working with people in their supply chain.
Yeah, and it was interesting the language they used around that actually. Some of them you were like, oh, clearly you're doing that in partnership, because you know we're a nation of SMEs. So, and to get a basic carbon footprint done through Toitu as an SME, one of my students told me, who runs an SME, that's $17,000. So it's a lot of money. So my other key thing is to actually help SMEs to report, because all the data you need to report is on the MFE website. It's not that hard to do. So that's my other kind of push that I'm trying to do as well with some of the stuff. But yes, and some of them are kind of supportive, and other times you read, well, that's in our supply chain and they need to sort themselves out kind of attitude, and you're sort of like, oh, okay. And you get that kind of pushing it down to the supply chain as the problem. And so there's a variety of different responses there. And some of them I was a bit like, you know, reading them was like, well, actually, you've got a responsibility to help your supply chain because you're one of the biggest companies in the country. And so there was kind of, there was a discrepancy, but definitely much more talk across the supply chain in this space. Yeah, yeah, it's more alignment. Yeah.
Karaoke.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. I was just thinking in terms of maturity models, and you've got your 1 to 5 on those 3 levels, whether you'd be going in with SMEs and looking at where they're at, where they see themselves on that and providing that support to make the shift forward.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because the likes of your Meridians who I showed, I mean, they've been doing this stuff for a long time. It was back in the 2000s they were trying to claim carbon neutral stuff. So, you know, they've been managing and measuring emissions for a while. And then you've got someone, you know, new off the rank who's, you know, it's a big, steep learning curve. So, yeah, there's definitely, I wouldn't want to compare a small SME with some, so it's good to kind of keep them separate in a way. And in some ways, even comparing them with each other, it gets quite difficult as well. It's more them against themselves and doing better against themselves, I'd like to see. Yeah, we're not big enough to compare across the industry in New Zealand at the moment. Yeah, so it's tricky in that regard. But yeah, definitely, you can get better at reporting, but it doesn't mean that you get better at being good with your emissions.
It reminded me a little bit of ministerials in government, where you say the best thing that your agency is doing according to, you know, having to report. And, you know, you have B Corp has an auditor come in. And so I was just wondering whether there was going to be some sort of extra auditing wrapped around.
They're mainly getting it through because part of your climate risk disclosures will be your emissions profile. So they'll include emissions profile in that regard. And that's how I think they'll go down the mandatory line. And then I think they'll just keep, at the moment, it's companies that have a turnover of over 200 million, I think, off the top of my head, that have to do the mandatory reporting. So it'll just drop down till we get most. And then you'll have nature-based disclosures coming in. So there's something else coming, don't worry. So our organisations are going to be hit by lots of different things because, as we rightly know, we can't just focus only on emissions. We've got to look at our biodiversity issues as well. So that will be next. Those are the ones I'm really looking forward to. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much.